want to talk about Marxism-Leninism and what does that mean exactly for the party and how we see it. How we see Marxism-Leninism, and I've touched upon this briefly before, and a lot of this is the subject of my upcoming book, not the manifesto of the party, but my actual book. So, firstly, what are the five heads of Marxism? And the interesting thing about the five heads of Marxism is that the last head, which is Mao, has created the precedent for kind of infinitely new syntheses of Marxism. So under the head of Mao, you have Deng Xiaoping, you have Xi Jinping, and there's even people in between that, if you can believe it, because they're all part of the process by which Chinese Marxism is being synthesized across history. But we broadly compartmentalize that under Mao because they're still within the kind of Mao Zedong thought paradigm, at least in my view. But what does it mean for there to be a synthesis, and what is the status of these thinkers? We call them heads, but what are they? And in my view, they're not philosophers. In my view, they represent a different type of relationship between thought and reality, and therefore between thought and itself, which is different from philosophy in the sense that it's not a relationship between thought and the form of thought, or vice versa. It's a relationship between thought, the mind, and some kind of more determinate historical reality. Now, why do I say determinate? Not my intention to gibber. I hope a 5-year-old can understand this. Well, because in the Marxist view, there isn't just a dichotomy between forms as thought and a kind of formless, chaotic reality of pure content and pure flux and whatever. Rather, the mode of production and the social relations of production and history at large, a given kind of integral historical era, if you will, is determinate. And although it's not the expression of a divine mind or a divine logos, it is determinate, and in some sense, it has form. Such was Stalin's explicit view when it came to the national question, by the way. But is it form in the same way that Plato meant it? Well, not quite. But it's form in the sense that it is determinate. It is a determinate way. Maybe there's a proximity there to the Tao or the Tao. Everyone is conflicted as far as how that is worded. Tao or Tao, is a D or a T, I don't know. But it's a specific way in which material reality is constituted. My former occult teacher from the Sarmung Brotherhood, from the Iranian Sufi occult order, the architectonic order of the Eschaton, Reza Nagaristani, he has a book called Intelligence and Spirit, where he kind of fleshes out this Hegelian notion of intelligence, right? Because it's a word a lot of people use, but they don't, conceptually, they have a very weak grasp as far as what that word means, where intelligence refers to something collective. Intelligence is something actually at work in reality somehow. And this view is idealistic, and he, in that book, proudly avows it as such. But the Marxism doesn't simply reject this Hegelian view of the kind of the rationality of history, the kind of the external kind of collective supra-individual mind, right? We just don't regard it as a mind, but it is still something. That's the kind of deeper point. It is still something. It's just not a mind. In fact, a mind, in reference to this something, is still too methodologically individualistic. When Hegel uses the words reason and mind and understanding and so on, he is using methodologically individualistic terms which ultimately refer to some individual thinker. And this is the philosopher's God, basically. That's the individual in question. But it's clearly not an individual. It's something supra-individual, something collective. And precisely what that is and what it refers to, Marx worded and named as communism itself, as this kind of, it's sort of an equivalent to this logos underlying reality itself, but it's not a logos. But as far as what it is, Marx will say it is a kind of, relationship between man to man, or to woman more specifically, as species being. Species being a specific type of being which is commensurate with its own particularity, its own, well, I wouldn't say exclusive, but its own particular existence, right? Its particular essence. It's in accords with that essence, right? And the essence being something particular, right? So this is the meaning of species being in Marx. Now, in any case, this is what Marx means by the human, by the way. By the human, Marx is not actually talking about some kind of ideal of man. He's not talking about some kind of pretense of universal man as the idea of man, or what man ought to be, or what man should be. By mankind, by the human, Marx is referring to a relationship which is suspended in the process of reproduction. The epitome of that relationship, according to Marx, is the relation of man and woman, right? Which is literally the relationship that gives rise to the birth of and the reproduction of human beings, right? But Marx extends this relationship also to the subsistence and sustenance of mankind, how it produces its existence, how it survives, how it, acquires shelter, how it acquires food, how it acquires, clothing, and so on and so on. So that is Marx's critique of idealism, I guess. The critique of idealism was not the view that there are forms or determinate things in reality. The opposition to idealism rather lied in the view that these determinate things take on the consistency of a thought, or a given form of thought, rather. So, what does it actually mean for there to be a kind of So drawing from this, how does Marx justify his synthesis within Marxism-Leninism? Or rather, how do we justify Marx's inclusion in it? As we know, Marx was no statesman. So was Marx just a philosopher? Well, first of all, no. Marx is the closest of everyone within the canon of Marxism-Leninism to philosophy, but his inclusion is defined precisely by his naming and his discovery of the object which is beyond the threshold of philosophy, which is the immediate object which initiates the process by which the mind and the intellect becomes involved in its own historical premises. That's why Marx is named Prometheus. The comparison to Prometheus is that Prometheus stole fire from the gods and gave the fire to humanity. But the gods in question, as far as Marx is concerned, is the realm of philosophy. And Marx is taking something from the realm of philosophy, namely the supreme principle of logos, and he is returning it to mankind as it actually exists, and in particular, mankind as the proletariat. He is taking the fire, the Heraclitean fire, I can't, whatever, the proper way of describing a fire belonging to Heraclitus. He's taking that and he's bequeathing that to mankind. Something that was the pure province of the philosophers. So this is what Marx's first gesture is. And in doing so, Marx begins the process by which thought is related to reality in a way that actually affects reality. But the principal manner by which Marx affected reality, beyond his actual involvement in the proletarian movement, which he was involved with, we shouldn't discount that, but that wasn't his principal achievement. His principal achievement lied in something else. His principal achievement lied in capital, producing capital. So Marx's contribution to the synthesis proves that in order to be part of the synthesis of Marxism-Leninism, you don't necessarily have to be a statesman, or it doesn't necessarily have to be earned on the basis of having a political savviness in general, even organizing movements. But it does have to affect and alter the fabric of history itself. It does have to alter, to use an inappropriate kind of phrase, the intelligence of history. It has to affect and shape that in some kind of way. And Marx did precisely do that, because Marx was the Word. He was the Word, the first text of the workers' movement. Capital was like the scripture of the workers' movement that took off kind of in Marx's later life and after he died. He was the first person to name the symptom, in precisely as Lacan said and meant. So that's Marx's inclusion. Marx the Prometheus. Engels, how did Engels contribute to the unique synthesis of Marxism-Leninism? That was similar, in a similar way as Marx. Engels was not a statesman, and his primary contribution was not any kind of political savvy, and so on and so on. But why is Engels distinct from Marx, though? I would say Engels is primarily distinct from Marx because of his works like the Dialectics of Nature, right? What Engels is doing is he is initiating the process by which the very same outlook discovered principally by Marx could be applied to modern science and technology and so on and so on. And it's Engels for whom that paradigm becomes strongly emphasized. Engels is also known for many other kinds of works. The Origin of the Family, the Rise of Early Christianity, so on and so on. He was, in a sense, a kind of, also, he simplified Marxist thinking in more than a few works of his, right? But the thread bearing all of this in common is that Engels applies Marx's insight into reality in a way that is scientific and empirical, and not exclusively. Capital is also scientific and empirical, but it's something much more than that. That's the thing. It's something much, much more than that. With Marx's notion of commodity fetishism and so on, in Capital, Marx establishes a clear relationship between thought, the form of thought, and the form of reality itself. And he establishes that very clearly in Capital, in addition to yielding the kinds of empirical and economic insights that he is. He's establishing, first of all, a way in which the mind can be related to and connected with its economic premises. And of course, Marx and Engels are inseparable. So Engels' inclusion within the synthesis is inexorably connected with Marx's inclusion. Now, with Lenin, what is Lenin's primary contribution to the synthesis of Marxism? Now, that is a long story. It's precisely Stalin who synthesizes Marxism-Leninism in his book Foundations of Leninism, where he precisely lays out precisely how that was. But Lenin, let's be clear though, to simplify it, his inclusion in the synthesis of Marxism-Leninism, which he is the first synthesis of Marxism-Leninism. I mean, he's the first person that it's actually formally synthesized. In order to justify Marx and Engels' inclusion, it's kind of retroactive or retrospective, how you say it. But Lenin is the first person who, in reality, leads to this synthesis. In reality. Why not the Social Democrats? Yeah, but I'll tell you why. Precisely because the Social Democrats couldn't synthesize Marxism and relate it to their practical political activity. There was a kind of cognitive dissonance that was there from the very beginning that, as a matter of fact, actually gives rise to revisionism much before World War I. For example, Bernstein and so on and so on. So that's why. The Social Democrats were still a little bit confused about what Marxism actually was, let's say. Now, Lenin connects Marxism with political authority. He connects it with the method by which political authority is founded in the first place, in the form of the party form. He connects Marxism with the formal aim of social democracy, the unity of Marxism and the workers' movement. Well, Lenin expands that on a much grander scale. It's the unity of Marxism with the whole of civilization itself, right, in the form of this huge majority peasantry. So Lenin's synthesis of Marxism-Leninism is based in this kind of directly political, practical, historical contribution. Now, Stalin's inclusion, I think actually Stalin himself would contest, which he did contest to the extent of my knowledge within his lifetime. Stalin avowed himself only as a student of Lenin, which is why they didn't call it Marxism-Leninism, Stalinism, although Kojev liked to call it that. Stalin's inclusion, first of all, he formally synthesizes Marxism-Leninism in the writing of Foundations of Leninism. As the faithful student of Leninism, he realizes Lenin's contribution in ways that Lenin himself did not live long enough to foresee or expect. He was very ambiguous about what his legacy would amount to himself. And Stalin realizes that in a specific way. But if you want the TLDR, it's socialism in one country. That is really the groundbreaking contribution of Stalin, the precedent that he sets. Socialism in one country and his writings on the national question and his understanding of the relationship between Marxism and form in general, the dialectic of form, which is that's really the essence of the national question, by the way. The national question is about the form of class struggle, which is national, right? So this is Stalin's, there's much more, but this is kind of a way to simplify it. Now, Mao is, this is like explaining rocket science, probably. Because I want to explain this in a way that doesn't sound like Badiou bullshit, like, which is kind of true, though, that he introduces infinity into Marxism. Which is true, but how do you make that more concrete, you know? Well, what Mao contributes to the synthesis of Marxism-Leninism is that he fully emancipates within the kernel of Marxism-Leninism an essence from the limited form that it takes that's still borrowed in many ways from social democracy. Mao's contribution is about the refounding of Communist Party authority from scratch in an environment where, in contrast to Russia's combined and uneven development, the existence, realized existence of a proletariat is negligible, right? So, on what basis could Communist Party authority and existence and organization be founded on in such circumstances? By emancipating Marxism and Marxism-Leninism at large from the pretense of having a clearly defined conceptual, or I should rather say empirical referent, tangible empirical referent in a readily constituted proletariat, Mao discovers a deeper essence of the proletariat, which could actually be applied in countries where one has not yet come into existence in a tangible or definite way. And this is what is meant actually by the Sinicization of Marxism, the unique conditions that they attribute to be unique conditions of China, which make the traditional application of Marxism, which, I mean, you could say something similar about Lenin in Russia as well, but even in Russia, Russia still had a factory proletariat. It's just that Lenin pursued a different strategy for that proletariat. But notice how Mao is more advanced than Lenin. Because if you look at the events of the October Revolution and the Civil War, the socialist revolutionaries had to be liquidated. And they represented an element that was missing in Bolshevism, that had to be absorbed in Bolshevism, which it was. The left SRs that got absorbed into the Bolshevik movement. That alliance was necessary, very necessary, to constitute an alliance between the proletariat and the peasantry. But what Mao does is he consolidates support among the peasantry itself directly. The Communist Party of China having its basis in the peasants, without a need to make an alliance with some kind of authority, a separate authority representing them. So Mao's synthesis of Marxism-Leninism corresponds to the political history of Mao's rule within China. And in particular, Mao's understanding of the continuation of class struggle and class contradictions under socialism itself, which is, by the way, related to this kind of more broad kind of way I'm characterizing Mao's contribution. The continuation of contradictions under socialism, or class struggle under socialism, appears to be baffling and mysterious when in consideration of the fact that by the time the Cultural Revolution begins, there is no clear bourgeoisie. And if there is, it's definitely not one that has any influence or power. There is also no clear status of the proletariat. I mean, there's a factory, there's a strata of society that's working in factories, but can they really be called proletarians when the factories they're working in are state-owned and so on and so on? So, the proletarian Cultural Revolution, it's waged in great bulk in the countryside, right? So, how could the notion of the continuation of class struggle within China or under socialism, I should rather say, be justified? Well, what Mao understands and what Mao recognizes is that class struggle is not reducible to the form of a conflict between, let's say, two tangible parties. That class struggle refers to a dialectical tension and contradiction that is at the heart and the founding and the constitution of any modern state or society. Even before we can say there is a readily formed proletariat or bourgeoisie, it's actually the contradiction that pre-exists the formation of these definite classes. And this is what is discovered in the Cultural Revolution. What is the object of proletarian consciousness, really? What does it mean to realize socialism correctly? What is the dictatorship of the proletariat? This was a movement, by the way, toward the end of his life, Mao himself initiates. The movement of, like, what did Lenin mean by a dictatorship over the bourgeoisie? What did he mean by the fact that, for example, the bourgeoisie constantly is reproducing itself at every minute, at every day, at the thresholds of society, at the furthest thresholds of society, whatever that quote is? Well, what he meant by that is that the symptom, let's call it, of capitalism can't be pinned down on the actual tangible form of capitalism, that it refers to a level of the development of civilization and society and a specific dialectical tension whose development, as the Cultural Revolution itself proved, could not be reduced to any kind of political form. Like, even if you have a proletarian dictatorship in a socialist state, you have not really addressed the root causes of what is called capitalism. So the profound conclusion of Mao, at least implicitly, with Deng Xiaoping it's explicit, is that a proletarian dictatorship can only oversee the correct development historically of society, but it cannot politically legislate this. And socialism is born of not a kind of ideological project to be imposed upon reality, but a tendency that arises from reality itself, one which includes the birth pangs of capitalism that preceded it. And these birth pangs cannot be legislated away. So for Mao, this implies an understanding of Marxism, socialism, capitalism, the proletarian class, the bourgeoisie, and so on, which is finally liberated from the kind of methodological individualism or substantialism of, let's call it, vulgar Marxism from social democracy. He acknowledges that the reality of a mode of production is processual. It's not based in some kind of empirically tangible form that's static or definite. It's more of a processual kind of, literally a mode of production. One, again, which cannot be determined or legislated voluntarily, but represents something objective. So that class struggle continues under socialism, and the lesson of the Cultural Revolution proves this, doesn't mean that that struggle has to be antagonistic. It doesn't mean that there is a group of people who have to be destroyed and liquidated, and this is how class struggle will manage. This is Lenin's Clausewitzian class struggle as applied in Russia, which you could say was correct for the time, right? But Mao represents a more refined and a more developed uh, understanding of Marxism, where class struggle does not necessarily directly correspond to Clausewitzian warfare. It's an indirect relationship, right? That's why Mao develops the notion of primary and secondary contradictions. And in the face of imperialism, class struggle is a secondary contradiction. Or am I getting those reversed? I always get them reversed, I think. Regardless, the antagonistic contradiction was imperialism, the one that has to manifest itself as political warfare. Whereas class struggle can be dealt with through the wise governance and effective leadership of a communist party, which can suppress the emergence of a bourgeois class by reaffirming the integrity of the party authority, which is the proletarian dictatorship. See, in China today, I'm not exactly sure if they accept the view that class struggle still exists in China. I think it's a contentious notion to the extent of my understanding. But the way I see it is that, yes, it's still there, but it doesn't take an antagonistic form. The class struggle takes a more passive form through the integrity and sovereignty of the state itself, the party dictatorship itself, which keeps at bay and suppresses the possibility that there could emerge a bourgeois class, which is actually constituted as a class, which can constitute itself as a private interest, separate from the interest of the whole people. So these are real kind of historical contributions based in practical relationships with history, and with the creation and construction of states and movements. And a positive contribution, which is irreversible, was made. It doesn't mean Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, and Mao are above any criticism. It just means there needs to be acknowledged a recognition that they did contribute something irreversible to history, which is a necessary premise and a necessary beginning for communist activity anywhere. That's why, ironically, the main thing I would probably disagree with Orthodox Chinese Marxism-Leninism about, which I'm not sure is a disagreement, but I would disagree with the view that Mao was something that's only specific to China. In my view, Mao made a universal contribution to Marxism. And Mao, to me, Deng Xiaoping and the rest, culminating in Xi Jinping, I'm not saying every leader in China after Deng Xiaoping, but there are a few that have been added to the synthesis of Marxism-Leninism there. There is a universal lesson to be drawn from them that does have significance everywhere, not just in China. So this is my view, that we must all be Chinese in some sense. As a matter of fact, I reject the view. You see, there's something I want you guys to think about, because it's really interesting. Maturing as Marxists, in somewhere along the course of our development, we come to think that, okay, the Ushanka Soviet flag, Katyusha, listening, that song, it's a good song, that's just kind of LARP. Like, okay, those are not really inherently communist, it's just something specific to Russia. You're not a Russian. Why are you LARPing as a Russian? You should have a uniquely national character. Broadly speaking, there's truth to that, but it's actually not the whole truth. For example, after the French Revolution, I don't know if you guys knew this, but across all of Europe, all of the Democrats, not the US political party, but like revolutionary Democrats, right, who wanted to overthrow the ancien regime across Europe, would wave French flags. Not because they were pretending that they were ethnically French, but because the French nation, state, had a symbolic significance that was fundamentally rooted in the ideals of the French Revolution, which Europeans at that time thought had universal applicability. So the content of the French Revolution, let's call it inappropriately, the ideals or the ideals, it's not the technically correct term, but it's more correct than this kind of racialism, which just reduces it to something specific to the French nation. That had a universal significance, and it led to the cultural soft power of France in Europe. So that the soft power, see, a nation earns its seat at the table on the global stage when it contributes something universal. That's when the soft power of that country gets absorbed. If you look at, I looked at Chinese border troops, and it's like they're still wearing clothes that in many ways was inherited from the Soviet uniforms, you know? And the Chinese paradigm of technology still has a bedrock and basis in the Soviet technical expertise that came after 1949 to help the young China. And there's many aspects of Chinese culture today, at least political, maybe higher culture, whatever, but which is fundamentally influenced by Russia. I mean, Russia has made an influence on China, not just in its capacity as a communist Russia, but like a new kind of fusion and synthesis, not synthesis in the loaded sense, but basically Russia's civilizational soft power affected China because of that political relationship. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's not an inherently, inauthentic or false thing. So in the same way, we should not be afraid of the soft power cultural influence of China. China has made an indisputable contribution to the development of world history and represents the most advanced civilization on Earth today. From the Marxist perspective, it's not just the most advanced socialist civilization, it is the most advanced civilization. And my Chinese friends would probably object to that, and because they're humble. They say, no. But no, I insist, from the Marxist perspective, China is the most advanced civilization in the world today. Absolutely is. From the Marxist perspective, China is leading the way as far as the revolutionizing and development of the forces of production and the transition into a new mode of production and a new era. Absolutely, China is leading the way. China is the most advanced civilization in the world. We should not be afraid of adopting aspects of that. See, there's two forms of extreme LARP. One that is exclusively foreign, and it's only foreign with no roots in your nation. And the other one is purely your country, refusing to accept influence from anywhere else. We should combine, we should adopt aspects of Chinese culture and history and Russian culture and history and combine them with our unique national context. We shouldn't be afraid to adopt the things that work or that are aesthetically striking and significant and apply that to the context here. It's in this kind of sense, of course, we're internationalists. We're not trying to just have a pure America. There's no such thing. It's an interconnected world that we live in, So you should not be afraid of that soft power influence. I mean, do you need to wear an Ushanka hat? Maybe, maybe not. But let's say a civil war started tomorrow in a science fiction scenario. Is it wrong to adopt, historical Russian military thinking? Like deep battle or whatever? Probably not. It'd probably be a good thing to learn from that kind of stuff, right? If it works, it works. That is the American way, you know? After all, that is the American way. And let's face it, Russians do get things right that we don't get correct. They do things that are correct that we don't. You know, whether it's fashion, whether it's, you know, ways of going about stuff and so on and so on. So let's not worry about that. Let's not try to purify the meaning of the unique national form of Marxism into something that is exclusionary and purely exclusive. Because, you know, look anywhere, even in Cuba, there's aspects of Russian culture that made their way into Cuba. There's nothing wrong with that. And most of the world today speaks English. You know, that's an aspect of English culture that's, you know, made its way across the whole world. You know, see, Stalin's socialism in one country was not about, it was not about closing yourself off from the world. And I'm going to go ahead and say something crazy. I mean, we don't agree with globalism, but there is a dynamism of this new dimension of globality that emerges, you know, let's say Y2K post-90s, which we absolutely have to, like, accept as historically progressive. And globality is not, to me, globality is not universal human rights. To me, globality is how in Peru, randomly, there's just some Shia cleric who's like creating like a Peruvian Hezbollah, like recruiting local indigenous Peruvians, and it's like, for some reason, it makes sense there. That is the meaning of globality to me, you know? And there's nothing wrong with that. As a matter of fact, that is something very interesting. You know? That's kind of globality. Globality is kind of like when Trump visited India, there were some Hindu shrines made to Trump. That's an example of now, is that something good? Probably not, because we don't like Trump, but it is very funny, and it's a symptom of globality, right? Globality is like, you know, let me think of something. Globality, you know what globality really is? Globality is like the Hamas videos. If they're not made by Hamas, please forgive me, because the internet said they were. Maybe they weren't. Farfour, the Mickey Mouse. Mickey Mouse being used in Hamas propaganda. That is an example of globality, you know? But they didn't call him Mickey Mouse, but still, it's like they repurposed this symbol, which is a global symbol, but they could somehow apply it locally, right? That's really the kind of meaning of globality I'm talking about. You know, when you randomly see, when the Iranian IRGC says, you know, or who said this? Khamenei said this, I think. They said, "What heroes of America will we strike? SpongeBob?" That's globality. They're talking about SpongeBob, you know? So there's a dynamism of the globality that we like. And we don't want to close ourselves off and just LARP as if we represent some kind of purity of parochial America, because we don't represent that. We are here to usher a new age into America and lay hold and seize that new age. You know, we are, you know, when I think about American Communist Party, when I think about ACP, and I think about what it really is, it's like what it represents is this kind of, it represents this acceleration of the digital age politically. Like, we are here to update the superstructure in tandem with the updated base, already updated base. You know, it's like I think of it as how did I imagine it the other day when I was thinking about it? I think of it as like it's like we're here to connect the entire country to this like global social media. It doesn't have to be global necessarily, but this like new digital collective consciousness hive mind. You know, we're here to kind of, it's like Death Stranding, kind of like we're here to connect America. We're not here to like go to rural America and embrace the backwardness, technological backwardness and cultural backwardness. When I say cultural backwardness, I don't mean conservatism. I mean like they're just not, they're, you know what the most progressive thing ever that's not directly communist is but originates in China? TikTok. It's like TikTok's already beaten us to the punch, you know? Americans, however rural and however remote, all use TikTok. And like they're able to kind of express their like rural, parochial sensibilities and like be connected with this like kind of fully digitized, fully connected on the national level, you know, sphere of culture and reality. And it's so cool, you know? And that's what we want to do at the political level. Because a lot of these rural areas in America, because their backwardness is taken it. When I say backwardness, again, I don't mean ideologically. I mean like literally in terms of like just they're not up to date with technology or anything or culture. What happens is you have these corrupt evangelicals and corrupt politicians that go in and take advantage of that, and they keep people in the Stone Age, right? And we're here to liberate them by going down and including them and making them a part of the national conversation. You know, right now they're being left behind.